Thank you very much, Tegan. That was great. And now I'd like to invite Joshua Wong and Shaun Rein onto the up here, please. Joshua Wong, as I'm sure you all know, is Secretary General of Demosisto, and Shaun Rein is founder of the China Market Research Group based in Shanghai. Thank you very much for joining me.
Okay.
Now, rarely, I think, has a debate been more timely. Debating Hong Kong is our subject today, and we've got 25 minutes to sort out something that many of us have been debating for weeks, months, years, decades. So what I'd like to do is ask each of our speakers to speak for 3 minutes each, and then possibly very briefly perhaps respond to each other. And then I'd love you all to have a think about what you want to ask our panelists, and anyone online as well would be great. So Joshua, would you like to start?
Okay. Good evening again. It's my honor to share some of my point of view and insight of what's going on in Hong Kong. I strongly aware and realize how the real confidence crisis emerging in Hong Kong since yesterday after Hong Kong government announced to impose the new law by the Emergency Regulation Ordinance, which just put Hong Kong people in a more difficult and complicated situation. As we are aware how banks calls happen in Hong Kong, how residents in different major districts, they just rush to the bank or ATM machine to take the cash out. Or even lots of the elderlies, they just went to supermarket to stock food before this long weekend. This kind of incident or dynamics never happened before Hong Kong government formally announced and execute the emergency ordinance. Apart from how the confidence crisis never happened in the past few months under the clash of violence or protest, but happened since yesterday after the announcement of Carrie Lam. We also aware the working class discontent happened recently. Yesterday, 3 hours before the formal announcement from Carrie Lam, lots of professionals and lots of working class, they marched during the lunchtime, during the lunch hour at Central or Taikoo, the central business district of Hong Kong, and to against the impose and the execution of the emergency ordinance. In the past few years, when lawmakers were unseated, activists including me were jailed, and how book publishers have been kidnapped to Hong Kong. Hong Kongers have less intention or incentive to talk to the street. But even during the normal weekday, we have Hong Kong people, perhaps they may be accountants, they may be lawyers, and they suddenly strongly realize how Hong Kong is under such chaos generated by Beijing authorities. And it's just results in the march suddenly happen in the central business district, in the CBD. So after explaining about the working class discontent and the concrete confidence crisis of people, not towards the protester, but towards the government, I hope to emphasize on the fundamental way out or the solution. Hong Kong people have asking for free election since 3 decades. In the previous day, perhaps business sector might have lots of hesitation. Just like 5 years ago during the umbrella movement, business leaders were the one criticized on the umbrella movement. But in the past few months, we have experienced and realized how Hong Kong government and Beijing are not only generating chilling effect to protesters, but even targeted business sector. No matter the Cathay Pacific CEO need to resign, or other business sector leaders face lots of uncertainty and interference from the pro-Beijing camp, which just imply that we have to safeguard Hong Kong political and economic freedom. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you very much. Sure.
So first off, thank you so much to The Economist for inviting me here. I think it's great that we have the opportunity to have an open and safe debate where it's very important to hear different views. Safety is important. So I first want to challenge Joshua to condemn publicly violence that's been targeted at mainland Chinese as well as mainland businesses. Because I'll tell you, even me, and I generally am pro-Beijing, and I think that's well known, I sympathized with you during the umbrella protest. I sympathize with a lot of the protests over the last 100 days. But once I started to see the violence, like at the JP Morgan employee yesterday who said, "We are Chinese," and then he got punched in the face. Once I start seeing attacks on mainlanders, that's when we start to lose support for you. And I'll tell you, I live in Shanghai, and many mainlanders have told me the exact same thing. So I challenge you to condemn that publicly after I'm done speaking. But second, what I want to do is talk a little bit about more concrete actions on how we can solve the problems in Hong Kong. Right now, we hear a lot about freedom, or evil, or the vote. What I want to do is look at if Joshua Wong is the next CEO of Hong Kong, or if he's the governor, or if there's universal suffrage, there's still the same underlying issues that are facing Hong Kong. So let's take a look at what those issues are and how we can solve them. It starts back from the 1980s. The 80s and 1990s, Hong Kongers were very scared of mainland China. They said mainland China would be anti-business, anti-capitalist, and would destroy the golden goose and destroy Hong Kong as a global finance center, as Joshua named it before. So what did Beijing do? They did two things that were smart at the time but have caused problems long term. The first is they named a CEO rather than a governor. The CEO position then basically, instead of addressing the grievances of low and middle income Hong Kongers, started focusing and catering to the business community. That was problem number one. The second problem is they wanted to get the tycoons, like Li Ka-shing, the Kwaks, the Lees, the Wus, on board. Because the idea then was if you could get Li Ka-shing to support Beijing and support reunification, then the Hong Kongers would follow suit. So Beijing gave Li Ka-shing Wang Fujing Street, the main street in Beijing, to develop. Also did the same thing with Huaihai Zhonglu, with the Lees. What that has created is way too much wealth is concentrated in 5 families. It's very difficult for regular Hong Kongers to have upward social economic mobility. And that's caused a lot of desperation. They're unable to buy houses, and there's a lot of frustration. So I only have 20 seconds. So solution-wise, what I think there needs to be done is there needs to be a reformation of the local government. There needs to be, Carrie Lam should resign, okay? And again, I'm pro-Beijing, but she's done a horrible job. Second, what they need to do is increase inheritance tax. And most importantly, stop the monopolies. You cannot have Li Ka-shing and pay him when you go to the supermarket, electricity, housing, telecom, everything. And let me be clear, I don't think the tycoons are bad people. They're good people, but they're taking advantage of the system.
All right.
Thank you.
Thank you very much to you both. Joshua, a brief response, particularly on the question of violence.
Yeah, I love the remark on solution rights, especially we know the tension between protesters and mainlanders happened in the past few months. Yesterday is not the first incident and not the first accident that no one hope it to happen. I would say that instead of blame or condemn on any behavior of protester, I prefer to find out the solution and through the trial and error process, and to let us to realize that even protester, they will have the incentive or intention to have self-defense or self-protection. But how to use force and also keep and maintain public support is matter for us, especially apart from the clash happened yesterday with the staff of the JP Morgan. I think everyone in this room realized or remember what happening during the airport clash with the protester and the journalist or the spy come from mainland China. And after the clash happened and force have been used by protester with the trial and error and the deliberative democracy and the discussion on online forum with the trial and error principle. We also saw how protesters the day after apologized in the airport for the clash or the violence happened. So I think how protesters get the idea instead of criticize, blame, or condemn on anything. How to provide a concrete plan or solution is more important. And refer to the discussion and mention about the social upward mobility. Perhaps it might be part of the reason for young generation took to the street to join the protest and rally. But just let us to remember how it changed compared to 5 years ago. 5 years ago is the movement led by student leader or university student. But for the movement expand from 200,000 people to now 2 million, more than 2 million people. I just see how from the generation of baby boomers to millennials or Gen X, from youngster to elderly, and from the lower class to upper class elite. Just see how lawyer, accountants, doctor even being arrested and prosecuted with the riot charges. It's just proof that how cross-generation in Hong Kong engage in the movement.
Thank you
but
very
you're going to
much.
lose support from mainlanders and everyday Hong Kongers. I've been going out and interviewing a lot of Hong Kong people over the last month, and about 70% of them said, you know what, I originally sympathized with the protesters. But once it became a protest movement into a riot movement, that's when a lot of people shied away.
Yeah.
I think we should stop discussing that because we know that a lot of people are coming out on the street. So we know that, sure, there are some people who oppose what is happening in different bits. Shaun, I wanted to ask you something. Beyond, let me express some questions about whether, if you now had a change in the inheritance tax laws, that you would really dissipate the protests. But I'm interested in one of the things that you've noted, which is how much anger there is around right now. And this is, you know, for whatever reason, there is this rage about and disagreement about what it means to be Chinese, and a dislike by some Hong Kongers of mainland Chinese. But what should Beijing do about that? I mean, that's it's one thing identifying that as a problem, but what should they do about it? That's a very fundamental question.
Yeah, that's a great question. So the first, some of the anger. So I went out and I interviewed a lot of protesters yesterday, and there was huge anger.
No,
I'll get there. And one of the things that I found very interesting when I was talking to 18, 19-year-olds is I said, how much of it is anger towards mainland Chinese? And what they said was, I'm embarrassed to be Chinese. I'm embarrassed if people are going to say that they're Chinese and we're Chinese because they're uncivilized. There's a lot of looking down upon them as country bumpkins. So what does Beijing need to do? They need to start to readdress more benefits for low and middle class Hong Kongers. Now, what I would argue is that mainland China has actually been pretty good in their mind towards Hong Kong. And they've given incredible benefits towards Hong Kong passport holders. You can live in China, not pay income tax there. You can buy houses when there's a lot of limits on the number of homes that mainland Chinese can buy in, say, a Shenzhen or in a Shanghai. Somebody from Hong Kong can buy that. So they have done and enriched a lot of the Hong Kongers over the last 20 years. But what they've forgotten to do is get the low income and middle income to be able to increase.
So your argument is basically that people are protesting because they are not able to get rich enough. We'll come back to that in a minute. Joshua, I want to ask you, where is this heading? What's going to happen? Where's it heading?
It's the question that should be answered by Carrie Lam or the Executive
if
Council.
If she would have accepted our invitation,
yeah,
we would have had her
we
here,
hope she could come to the summit. It's hard for us to predict what will happen. Just like even 1 week ago, no one could imagine Hong Kong government will execute the emergency ordinance. But what we're aware is far more only focused on the lower or middle class difficulties or the challenge that they face. Lots of foreign media journalists in the past 3 months or around mid or late of June, they always ask that, people took to the street. It is only because they don't have enough salary and they have lack of good economic condition or etc. But it is the movement that only led by students. But I always told them the fact that Hong Kong is the global city almost with the lowest birth rate. And when we have more than 25% of population took to the street, I think it's far more than only about the upward mobility problem. For those lawyer or doctors, they took to the street and result in prosecuted by the riot charges. They really have a good quality of life and high social status or etc. And they have no worry or consideration on can they really reach to the upward mobility, upward social class, because they are already in that social circle already. So I think now the fundamental confidential crisis that I mentioned, how could be solved by the government? I think it's more than upward mobility and also refer to the question of sense of belongings. 10 years ago, people is still celebrating how Beijing hold the Olympic Games. 5 years ago, people still realized that Hong Kong government ignore our demand on free election, but still have a bit confidence or hope on expecting President Xi Jinping to be the reformer. And even some of the pro-democratic camp politicians 5 years ago openly declared that he or she or they hope President Xi could reform China and Hong Kong. But in the past 5 years with the hardline policy, which just implied that people have no hope on Beijing, and how people confidence and the satisfaction to both Hong Kong and China government rapidly reduced is also different with what happened in 2003 against the Article 23.
Okay. Thank you very much. I'm sure we've got tons of questions. I'd ask you to make your questions quick, please. We don't have much time, and we shall endeavour. Who would like to ask a question? Yes, we have a yes here. Excellent.
Hello. Okay. My question is more towards Joshua. Obviously, things have escalated, okay? And there's divide amongst people who have said, okay, now I've had enough, it's gotten out of hand. And I know that there are very peaceful people out there, because if everyone was rioting, there would be no Hong Kong left, okay? So everyone isn't rioting. I think that the violence and the anger and the rioting is the language of the unheard. People are angry and they're not being heard. Now, there's 5 demands now. Obviously, everyone can't get everything, but if they're willing to have dialogue with the other side, what is the other side willing to negotiate to end this and everybody come out with something that they came in looking for? So it has to end eventually. How will it end? And is that side, because I support.
Thank you very much. That's great. Thank you. So your question is, how will it end? And I'm going to have a second question as well from Haley Wong, who is watching online, who says, why is Joshua mainly asking for intervention from the US? So Joshua, very quickly, why are you asking for intervention from the US? And secondly, if you're going to negotiate, what can you negotiate? What's their room?
Hong Kong is being recognized as the global city. When almost 100,000 US citizens live in Hong Kong, and lots of US companies set up their Asia headquarters in Hong Kong, and Hong Kong is suffering in not only political but even humanitarian crisis, I think world leaders and also countries around the world, they must have a say on how to safeguard Hong Kong's unique status being recognized as the Asia financial center. And for the question about how we would turn out, or what's the next step about the escalation of the protester, of course, we don't expect everyone in this room or even every protester will agree on all the behavior of protester, no matter they use petrol bomb or etc. But I think how the public opinion, according to the survey conducted by university, is just proof that more than 75% of Hong Kong citizens agree the demand of universal suffrage, and more than 80% of Hong Kong citizens urge government set up the investigation commission, the independent inquiry on police brutality. So we may have disagreement or different opinion on the strategy, tactics, or behaviors, but Hong Kongers have the majority consensus on the political demand. So asking for dialogue, Hong Kong government, I would say that Carrie Lam has set up dialogue, but few days later, she just endorsed, agree, or approve how riot police use live round bullet shoot towards high school students. So I'm asking, on the one hand, you are asking for dialogue, and on the other hand, the regime or the authorities is holding the gun and use the live bullet point towards people. Is this the solution?
Thank you very much. We've got time for one more quick question and a very brief response. Yes, there's a question here. Thank you.
I have this question for Shaun. How do you think of this statement? Democracy is the best system to deliver peace, cohesion, and consequently prosperity, and that is because rulers, those in powers, are elected. So they are more responsive to the needs of the people. They could rule because they have the consent of the people, because they have the consent of the governed.
So I think democracy is great. But I think more important than democracy is you have a government that's willing to address the needs and the grievances of the everyday people, one that has good checks and balances, and a government that has regular leadership transitions. So I'll look at China, and one of the reasons why I like what the government has done is in 1989, only 65% of Chinese females were literate versus about 85% of Chinese males. Now the number for Chinese born after 1989, it's 99.7% for males and 99.6% for females. In 1989, the average per capita GDP of India and China both were about 300. China right now is 9,100 US dollars, while India is only 1,850. So China has done something right in the last 30 years. They are addressing the grievances and the needs of the everyday Chinese, which would be food, education, a way to move up economically. And there have been good leadership transitions since 1989, and there have been checks and balances. It hasn't been through a vote, through the wide population, but it has been through the elites. And there has been more balance of power under the Jiang Zemin, the Hu Jintao administrations than a lot of people give credit for. You know, again, you look, Boris Johnson was directly elected by 160,000 people. He wasn't elected by every single British person.
Right, and there will be a chance for the British people to have their say, sure, which is the great difference. Anyway, thank you very much. I'm afraid we're out of time. Joshua Wong, Shaun Rein, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.